Let's look now at the interactions within a community among different species. Now, every species in a community occupies a certain role. This is what's called their niche or niche. Now, the niche includes things such as habitat, its food, behaviors, their role they play in that community. So they might be a habitat for some species, they might be food for a species, they might have a certain behavior in that community. So every species has its own niche. When we have organisms that actually have the same resource, then we have competition in that community. So species or organisms that use the same resource compete for that resource. If we have a resource that is being competed for between two different species, we call this interspecific competition. Interspecific, between two different species. So two different types of animals trying to get the same type of food or use the same resource. This would be different if there was competition between the same species, the same animal, and this is called intraspecific. Interspecific competition within one species. So two of the same animal or two of the same plants competing for the same resource. So you have to be very clear on the language. Interspecific and intraspecific means two different things. Well, if we have resources that are being used by different species, they may not be competing, they may be doing what's called partitioning, resource partitioning. And what this involves is two species that use the same resource in a different way. So rather than compete at the same time, they use it in a different way. And there are a number of examples of this, and one is the hunting pattern of a hawk versus an owl. Rather than compete with each other, the hawk will hunt during the day where the owl will hunt at night. This allows both of these species to hunt the same resource but not have to compete at the same time. They just go at different times during the day. And then the owl and the hawk can both survive in that ecosystem. Another term we want to be looking at here is what's called adaptive radiation. And what this is some species actually become specialized to use smaller parts of the niche. So have a smaller role or use those smaller pieces of the ecosystem. And there's many examples. Here's one of a finch looking at the different types of finches in the Galapagos Islands. And all of these finches have evolved from one common ancestor. But if we notice the beaks here, their beak patterns are different. Some have beaks that have adapted to eat the fruit and the seeds, the smaller parts of the niche. Whereas others were actually going to be adapted to eat insects or nectar. And if we look at the elongated beak, it is much, much easier to eat the insects and the nectar as opposed to this parrot-like beak that allows the finches to crush the fruit or the seeds. So this adaptation allows these finches to all survive in an ecosystem. Well, sometimes in an ecosystem we have species that were not originally there. And we call these foreign or invasive species. It's a new species to an area that are not native to that ecosystem. These foreign or invasive species have no natural predators. Since they haven't adapted to that environment, they're brought into that environment, they have no natural predators in the ecosystem, and this allows them to actually outcompete the species that already exist there, the native species. And these invasive species can be very, very harmful to the native species because they take the food away. Now, sometimes an invasive species is actually introduced on purpose. And most of our crops are actually foreign or invasive species. Crops that were never naturally growing in this part of the world, such as corn, are introduced to benefit humans. We can grow those food crops. Now, more often than not, though, invasive species are actually introduced unintentionally, and they turn out to be quite harmful. And Scotch broom, if you've ever taken a trip up island, you'll see this Scotch broom, this flowering yellow plant, which actually is very, very harmful to the native species. It can grow at a rapid rate. It can outcompete the native species for a resource. And so we get this unintentional harm. Someone brought Scotch broom over probably 100 years ago, and now it's become a very, very troublesome species that we actually have to try and remove from our ecosystem. Well, let's shift gears a little bit here and look at another part of an ecosystem, another part of a community, and this is called succession. And succession is the process of changing the types of plants that are in a certain community. This gradual change of the plants that are in that community. Now, succession, if we look at these two pictures, we can see that these plants start out as mosses down here, and over time, and that's what this represents, over time become these large tree plants. The same can be said in an aquatic ecosystem. The plants may be at the bottom of the water and eventually over time work their way up, and then we get into a marshy area over time. This is called succession. Primary succession is when we start out with a lifeless area that has no nutrients. So just bare rock or just water without nutrients. And this is the starting place for every community. Eventually, some species will find its way into that area. And this is what's called the pioneer species. It is the first species. This first species actually changes the environment and makes it suitable for other species to arrive. Over time, the rocks will break down and eventually make soil. And as there's soil, then seeds will arrive, whether they're from birds or from the wind. And as those seeds arrive, plants will grow. And those plants will put nutrients into the soil to support larger plants, and so on and so on. And so eventually we get down to what's called a climax community. And when we look at any ecosystem right now, we are seeing a climax community, a stable ecosystem at the end of the succession process. So succession has occurred thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of years ago. And we now get to a place where we have our climax community, the end of the succession process. And if we look at this picture, we can see the pioneering species first arrive with just rocks, and over time, as time goes past, that process reaches a climax community, and we have trees, and we go into our forests, and we can see a climax community. And that's what's called primary succession. There is another type called secondary succession. And what secondary succession represents is after a significant disturbance, so a fire or flood or clear cutting, something has disturbed the community, disturbed that ecosystem, and it removes the dominant plants from that ecosystem. And when we say removing the dominant plants, it might be in a matter of days or weeks, but eventually it gets down to no plants, but there's still soil and all the sediments. Since the soil and sediments still remain, the nutrients are also present, so those plants can actually come back very, very quickly. Again, relative to the original succession. So if we look at a forest, we clear cut a forest, we come back in 100 years. In the life of a forest, that isn't a long period of time, and we'll come back and we'll see that forest has recovered. And the same can be said with a fire and the flood. The nutrients are already present, so the plants come back quickly. Now, succession focuses on plants, but we also have to be aware that animals and decomposers are a part of this climax community. So it's not just the plants that are important, it's also the animals and the decomposers, and they too have a role in that climax community, getting it to a stable ecosystem.